Thanksgiving morning 2010, East Hartford, Connecticut. Police are called to a house at just before 7:30 in the morning. What they find is shocking.
They went into the house and they just found this horror show.
The scene was a virtual bloodbath.
But is this a random attack or a carefully planned execution?
Whoever did this had the advantage of time.
I think the police very quickly focused their investigation on some particular people.
As the investigation develops, detectives remain puzzled about a motive for the horrific events.
The violence of their deaths was indicative of someone who was very close and very angry.
Very angry at all three victims. It was overkill.
This is the story of a triple murder which horrified a small, tightly knit, peaceful community. How police finally uncovered a determined and ruthless killer, and how forensics played a pivotal role in solving the case.
When there's a stranger in the night, DNA evidence is very compelling.
Between the known and the unknown, it's basically like a fingerprint. The same person did this.
The Thanksgiving holiday of 2010 was to be shattered in Connecticut when police were called to a house on Naomi Drive in the town of East Hartford after they received a call from a concerned niece about the welfare of her aunt, Beverly Therrien.
Patrol was dispatched to 154 Naomi Drive from a out-of-state caller who said she hadn't heard from her aunt in several days, and they wanted us to check, make sure she was okay.
I received a phone call from my lieutenant saying that we had a triple homicide and that he needed my assistance. We found the front door to the home secure. There was also a newspaper and some mail that was overflowing that appeared to have not been gone through. The initial responding police officer had found that rear sliding door in the back of the home. It's off of a patio, unsecure. I observed on the steps leading up to this sliding door to the deck, there were two sporadic drops of what appeared to be blood at that time, and they were pretty heavy drops. They were very thick.
What the first responders saw upon entering the house shocked even the most experienced officers.
When they went inside and crossed the threshold and could start to see down the hallway, they saw what appeared to be large amounts of blood on the wall and on the floors, and when they went into the hallway, they found 3 deceased victims. There was just blood everywhere.
The police had also called Beverly's daughter Candice to get permission to enter the house.
Police had specifically asked her not to come to the house.
She wanted to know what was going on, where her mother was, is she okay? She was very distraught, and at one point we thought we needed to take her to the hospital via ambulance. However, she refused treatment and actually left the scene.
The police on the scene immediately called for backup and forensic assistance.
The crime scene was fairly shocking. I had never seen anything like this before.
One was found in a hallway near a bathroom, and 2 other bodies were found in a bathroom. What was found on injuries on the bodies of all 3 individuals and on some of the walls there appeared to be circular indentations, which were consistent with a hammer strike.
It looked as if the attacker had swung that tool and missed. All 3 of them were wearing nighttime clothes. They were in their pajamas, as if they may have been startled in the middle of the night.
The police soon identified the victims as Beverly Therrien and her 2 lodgers, Pamela Johns and Michael Ramsey. The crime scene team also noticed how the bodies were positioned in the house.
Michael was laying on his back, partially across Beverly's legs out into the hallway. Pamela was lying perpendicular to Michael's feet with her head away from his feet. The three deceased bodies within close contact with large gaping holes in their heads and brain matter exposed. There's skull fragmentation, there's blood cast off on the ceilings, on the walls. It was horrendous.
Also in the bathroom that suggested the signs of a struggle was a broken toilet seat lid. Michael Ramsey may have fallen back and hit his head while struggling with the attacker. Also in the bathroom, there was a shower curtain. The shower curtain appeared to have been pulled down, also we believe during a struggle. There were bloodlight stains on top of the shower curtain. Now, when we removed the shower curtain from the bathroom, there were several paper towel rolls found inside the tub that did not have any blood on them at all. So we believe those paper towels were placed in that bathtub prior to anybody being assaulted, as if the suspect was going to clean up the crime scene, or initially had an idea to clean up the crime scene.
The attacker must have been exposed and covered in blood if he was attacking these individuals, yet there was no blood trail leaving the house.
There were multiple plastic bags located in this area, so I believe that the suspect was going back and forth to this area grabbing plastic bags as he was cleaning up. We saw what appeared to be prints made by someone walking in blood on the kitchen floor.
And appeared to be socked feet, because there was a fabric pattern similar to a sock, a tube sock.
There were some other items of evidence that were found in the hallway. Some of those items included envelopes. They did have blood on them. It appears that someone was maybe possibly holding them and dropped them. The envelopes also had impressions on them that matched the impressions that were found in the kitchen. They were made bloody imprints that we later learned that were made from a sock. They sent a forensic scientist who used a special chemical that would enhance these footprints so that we could better see them.
What we saw when we used that chemical was a series of footsteps made by someone very large. I think they were like a size 13 foot, that walked into the kitchen and then walked back out into the hallway.
Beverly Therrien, who was in the bathroom, she was not wearing any socks. Michael Ramsey was not wearing any socks. And Pamela Johns, who was found in the hallway, was wearing socks, but the patterns on the bottom of the socks did not match.
Police also found another item of significance.
Another item of evidence that was collected was a plastic bag.
It was stuffed behind a bookcase in an adjacent room to the killing.
Whomever perpetrated this act touched that bag and was using that bag and other bags to start to clean up the scene or clean themselves up.
The attacker knew where those bags were because you couldn't see them right away. They were stuffed in a corner.
We found other items that we seized as evidence. One was this checkbook that just seemed to be laying out in the middle of Beverly's bed. We seized the cell phone cord. There was a cell phone cord that was right next to it as well. We seized financial documentation that had bank account information that was had been obviously gone through by whoever.
An item that we collected was a tissue. This tissue was collected in the threshold of a bedroom in the hallway.
The forensic examination was rigorous and exceptionally thorough.
We stayed 7 days in the crime scene, 24 hours a day. We had 2 shifts, 12 on and 12 off.
Taking, collecting all items and preserving them for potential forensic analysis.
With 3 dead people in such a violent attack, investigators were under pressure to find out if it was random or could the murderer be known to the victims. Given the severity of the attack, police knew they had to find the killer who might easily strike again. The evidence at the scene was plentiful, but would it yield any meaningful clues?
What I was interested in at that point in time was having DNA analysis conducted on those items.
It didn't appear to be a burglary gone wrong because only certain rooms were searched through.
Items that a person just burglarizing a house wouldn't necessarily be interested in. The manner of their deaths was indicative of someone who was very close and very angry.
What made the crime particularly unusual was the fact that it occurred in such a tranquil and community-focused neighborhood.
Naomi Drive was not a high crime area. It was a place that was pretty quiet. A lot of owner-occupied homes, and people took care of their homes, take care of their lawns, and knew each other, took care of each other.
They had a very close-knit community, and they were actually always close with each other.
This was a regular neighborhood, the kind that you would find in any community in America.
There were individuals who ranged in age. The younger neighbors would take care of the older neighbors, look after them, and they were really close to each other. There was certainly a great deal of surprise having a triple murder occurring on your street.
A heinous crime like this with tremendous violence has got to shake you up if it's in your neighborhood, if it's in your community.
One of the recurring themes that we were getting from doing a canvas in the neighborhood, especially with senior citizens, was fear. Fear of not knowing who did this. Fear of, is this person gonna come into my house next?
They were upset that their community was put on its head.
Within hours, detectives had established who the victims were and what they were doing in the house on Naomi Drive. 74-year-old Beverly Therrien lived in the house. The other two victims were 53-year-old Michael Ramsey and 60-year-old Pamela Johns.
Beverly Therrien knew a family member of Pamela Johns, and through that, she took Pamela Johns and Michael Ramsey, who we understood were in a dating relationship.
When we started looking at the histories of both Pamela and Michael, there really wasn't anything there in terms of arrests or people that they had problems with. We talked to their families. Michael was transient. Very small arrest record, nothing local.
Beverly Therrien had 3 children. And to the relationship she had with Andrew, her ex-husband who resided on Naomi Drive, she had 2 children, Brett Bednarz and Candice Bednarz. In investigating Brett Bednarz, he was a person who lived in East Hartford, would do some home renovation work, even had my understanding is purchased a home on the same street and was renovating that. His entire life, comings and goings with his mother, appeared to at times have a decent relationship with her. And somewhere along the road, the relationship deteriorated. Candice equally did not have a good relationship with her mother. It did coincide with the same time frame that Brett was not getting along with her. But again, there were points in time where Candice acknowledged that she was getting along with her mother. She was living with her. She allowed her mother to live with her, Candice, in her apartment in Manchester, Connecticut. And then there came a point in time where that deteriorated. Deteriorated to a point where there was police intervention for a domestic incident, and Beverly then was not living with Candice anymore.
Detectives now moved to interview Beverly's children.
We had sent detectives over to their Manchester residence. Candice was still very upset, emotional. Brett was very calm, didn't show a lot of emotion, didn't seem to be overly upset about learning that his mother was killed, and especially in such a brutal fashion. We noticed that Brett had some small cuts on the tips of his fingers. He also had a stubbed toe, and he attributed that to doing some electrical work around the house in Manchester and also bumping his foot into a piece of furniture around the house. They made it clear to us right at the beginning, the day that we found their bodies, the day that we went over there, that you have to talk to our attorneys if you want to talk to us. And we made several attempts to talk to them, and they refused to talk to us.
Detectives immediately got a warrant, as they suspected Brett's injuries were similar to cuts sustained in a struggle, and brought him in to take photos of his injuries. They also took a DNA swab. The initial forensic investigation indicated that Beverly was the first victim.
She was struck in the head multiple times, and she was sitting up against the bathtub, leaning up, and her feet were crossed. So we believe maybe someone had told her to go into the bathroom and sit down.
It appeared to me that she was very comfortable, or she knew who she was talking to.
There was no blood on her feet, which if she was moving around at the time that someone else, one of the other two, had been struck, there would be blood on her feet, because there was blood throughout that house.
There was no signs of struggle. She had no defensive wounds. Pamela had no defensive wounds. Michael was the only one that had severe defensive wounds. So I don't think it was a surprise to her as to who it was.
It appeared that Michael Ramsey had tried to fend off the attacker.
Michael Ramsey heard a commotion going on upstairs between Beverly and the attacker, and he came up the stairs to see what was going on. He then engaged the attacker. The two became involved in a physical fight.
He had some cut wounds on his hands and arms, which were consistent with him responding to the scene.
He did have a broken arm, and he had a severe wound to the front of his forehead. You could even see a partial piece of skull that was sticking through the skin, and also brain matter was also visible. Someone had stepped on his thigh. There was an impression that matched the impression on the envelopes in the hallway, and also the imprints on the kitchen floor.
But Pamela Johns had sustained the worst injuries.
Pamela Johns had significant damage to the back of her head. She was struck multiple times, very heavily. We believe that at one point, after him being struck, she may have grabbed her head and to feel, oh no, something is wrong. Her nails were broken, so in her hand she had a little bit of brain matter and her hair.
On the injuries that were sustained by these three individuals, there were axe-like injuries that crushed bone and just destroyed the bodies. We did not have a weapon found at the crime scene. The medical examiner was of the opinion that the injuries sustained by these individuals was most likely caused by a sheetrock hammer.
More significantly, there was no evidence of a break-in, and documents were strewn around the murder scene.
One of the first rooms that we began searching was Beverly Therrien's room. There were things thrown everywhere. There were piles of documents right when you walk in, as if someone had taken drawers and literally dumped them out onto the floor. So we had to go through piles and piles of paperwork. Within that paperwork, we found several personal documents relating to life insurance policies, changing a beneficiary for these life insurance policies, bank statements, letters. Beverly Therrien took notes on everything. Also in her bed was her purse. It appeared that someone may have dumped out the contents of her purse. Her checkbook was lying on her bed with her phone and her phone charger. It appeared somebody had gone through everything in her room.
The police theorized that whoever carried out the murder had an interest in the house and spent a considerable amount of time in the house searching for things.
There were items that would have interested a burglar that were not taken. We did find a large amount of cash inside her bedroom in a purse. It was a different purse. It wasn't the purse we believe she was using at that time. It also appeared to us that the person was very familiar with the home because of the things that we found downstairs, them going through the bins and looking for clothing that the attacker could have easily changed into.
It was becoming clear that Beverly was the first and intended victim, and that the other two may have been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Police began to investigate Beverly's family circumstances in greater detail. The murder had been vicious and sustained, but had it been random or something more sinister? Police now needed to focus on the Bednarses to see what might lie behind this horrific triple killing. It was clear from the outset of the investigation that the relationship between Brett and Beverly was exceptionally volatile.
Beverly's relationship with Brett was interesting, to say the least.
The relationship was extremely toxic, and each of them contributed equally.
But there were also portions in their lives where they seemed to be close, but there were also times when Beverly was quite nasty to Brett. And it didn't seem like she was nasty because he was being violent with her. She was nasty on her own. So I think it was a relationship that probably wasn't healthy for quite a long time.
There were reports of multiple instances of assaults by Brett against his mother. The police did not investigate all of them because they didn't get called for all of them.
She complained that she was pushed by Brett and she suffered a fractured hip.
He got arrested prior to this for assaulting her.
And he was accused of assaulting her with a broomstick, and she complained to the police about it. He was arrested.
As a result, there was a protective order put in place and he no longer was allowed to live in the house. That's how he ended up in Manchester. I don't think Beverly reported the other injuries and assaults because she was afraid for her safety. That if she did, that Brett would hurt her more or worse.
One document laid bare the seriousness of the difficulties between mother and son.
One of the things that we discovered was a letter that had been sent to the Manchester court from Beverly Therrien to the state's attorney. And within the letter, it said, night after night, I lay here waiting for Brett to come back and hurt me.
It appeared Brett's relationship with his father was at the root of the problem.
Beverly had been married to a man named Andrew Bednars, who was Brett's father. Andrew was older than Beverly, and he remained in East Hartford.
Brett and his father's relationship was very tight. Brett really loved his father.
And it was sort of an odd situation. Although Beverly and Andrew were divorced, they lived under the same roof. And Andrew was in his 90s when he passed away. And Brett became angry.
Brett blamed Beverly as being the cause of it, and he made it no secret to tell other people that too. Brett and Candice went into Manchester Bank after their father's death.
They were interested whether the mother was a new beneficiary or a changed beneficiary to these accounts.
And the bank officer said he couldn't tell them because they weren't signed onto the account and it was private information.
The bank manager was extremely scared, nervous, because Brett was demonstrating this anger, and although he revealed that, yeah, that in fact the account belongs to his mother.
Brett reacted violently, slammed his hand on the desk, and called his mother a derogatory name.
Brett even began to involve people who lived close by in the matter.
There was a neighbor who had a note that was placed on her car windshield in which Brett described his anger towards his mother, his rage toward her.
Basically, the note said that Beverly is the reason why Andrew is dead. She's made our lives a living hell. Don't worry, I have an ace up my sleeve. Karma can be a motherfucker.
Some neighbors had lived there for over 20 years, and they all consistently told a story about being confronted by Brett and being told about how much he hated his mother and how he was unhappy with the fact that she now had 2 roommates in her house. Several of them were quite alarmed. Brett Bednars would come up to them and just voice his disgust for his mother. He also spoke to them about his feeling that his mother was responsible for his father's death.
Clearly disturbed by Brett's behavior, Beverly had reached out to a friend of his.
Beverly Therrien, at a point in time around the weekend of her killing, had sent a letter to a Peter Lavoie. This was a person who was known to Brett Bednars and at a point in time was friends with him. The letter was received by Peter over the weekend that the individuals were most likely killed.
He also had been receiving phone calls from her from time to time, and he wanted to come in and talk to us about it. He was interviewed and brought the letter in, and basically it was a warning to Peter saying that you need to protect your family, be a man, Brett's gonna come, he's gonna hurt you, he's gonna kill you, he's gonna kill your family.
She wrote things to the effect of being concerned that she was going to be hurt. She said, I believe at one point in the letter, that she suspected that Brett was outside of her house, peeking in or lurking around. Beverly Therrien did say that she actually thought that her son Brett would kill her.
Investigators were also trying to track down a life insurance policy found at the crime scene. Beverly had recently changed the beneficiary on the policy.
An attorney reached out to us who represented Beverly's, confirming that in the week after her body was discovered, he was going to meet with her and John Hancock to change their life insurance policy and also redo her will. She had signed over a life insurance policy to Jose Ortiz, Beverly's ex-son-in-law that was once married to Candice. We flew down to meet him in Florida, and he talked to us a little bit about the dynamics between Candice and Brett with Beverly, and how Beverly did not trust or like Candice or Brett, and that she was fearful for her safety. He had told us that Beverly was changing all of this because she did not want her children to have any sort of inheritance whatsoever.
While police were interviewing neighbors in the area, they discovered that many had seen a suspicious vehicle at the time of the murders.
The home at the crime scene had a wooded area in the backyard, and adjacent to that wooded area was another street. It was called Jessica Drive.
Jessica Drive is a cul-de-sac that's south of 154 Naomi Drive. We also did a canvass in that neighborhood, and during the canvass, one of the neighbors said that they have seen a white Nissan Altima and a large white male exiting the vehicle and going into the woods.
This neighbor did not see where that individual went, but saw that he went in a direction that was consistent with moving in a direction towards the back of the Bednar's home.
Police soon learned that Candice Bednar's daughter was the registered owner of a white Nissan Altima, and that Brett was a regular user of the vehicle. Investigators were authorized to conduct a search. It yielded an extraordinary result.
The day that we seized the white Nissan Altima, it was actually at 154 Naomi Drive, and Candice was there. She asked to remove personal items from the vehicle, which we denied her. Then she told us in the trunk of the vehicle were 2 cell phones and cell phone chargers in a plastic bag that she said she believed to belong to Michael and Pamela.
Candice Bednar's offered these phones up to the police at a point in time when the police had just concluded searching this house, this crime scene, for approximately 1 week. During that period in time, they seized and inventoried other cell phones that were found in the house, yet miraculously, Candice Bednar's claimed that these cell phones were sitting there, and once the house was released to her as one of the interested homeowners, she just found them there, which was not true. When Candice Bednar's was pressed further, she acknowledged that she lied about where she found the cell phones. Now, she never admitted to taking them during the attack or anything of that nature, but it was very curious that she was in possession of items that were owned by 2 of the victims.
With suspicions growing, forensic investigators moved to examine the vehicle for additional evidence.
We had sprayed a solution in the trunk that would enhance anything that would react with a blood-like stain. And when we did that, we received a positive result in the trunk. It was a fairly large stain that was photographed. We also did send samples of this stain down to the laboratory, but the results were inconclusive. And the reason for this is most likely that when someone tries to clean up blood, it can mess with the DNA, so it can affect testing. So therefore, we got an inconclusive result.
Investigators traced Candice Bednar's footsteps during the time of the murders and were alerted to a safety deposit box that she frequently visited.
We had been notified that Candice had been seen going to that safety deposit box often and putting in large sums of money.
During the investigation, it was always everyone's position that Candice knew what occurred and potentially was involved in covering up the occurrence of this killing.
We found items in there such as a rare baseball card. We found money.
What was discovered was various receipts for doctor's appointments, things of that nature, with some notes placed on them. And what was curious to an investigator were the notes that were placed on them were where Candice was at a certain point in time, where Brett was at a certain point in time.
And handwritten on those receipts were a date that my mother was killed. Candice put those receipts and annotated those receipts in the safety deposit box because she knew somewhere down the line, she said, that when this, or if this came to trial, that would be proof that my brother didn't do this because he was with me and here are the receipts to prove that where we were during those times. Which was odd because we didn't know when the murders happened. But somehow she knows when the murders happened because she says this is the day that Mom died.
On December the 9th, police obtained a search and seizure warrant to bring in Brett Bednarz and to get his foot impressions.
We had a podiatrist come and look at the imprints that we had collected in the photographs that we had taken, and he had said that the person, based on what he was seeing in the impression and the photographs, was approximately 76 inches.
Brett Bednarz was a very large man, and he had very large feet. And I believe his feet were size 13.
We laid out a long roll of butcher paper and we inked his feet both with socks and without socks, and we had him walk up and down. We took the foot impressions, both known and unknown, to a local podiatrist when we asked for his expert opinion on it. He showed us some similarities between the known and the unknown foot impressions. Specifically, I think what was called a right abductor twist, in which there was an injury to one of the toes in both the known and unknown, and the rest of the foot compensates for that, and there was a very distinguishable pattern that was evidenced in both the known and unknown prints. It's basically like a fingerprint. The same person did this.
Investigators now focused on the blood-stained tissue found at the crime scene and were waiting on DNA results.
Think of DNA as just a very long ladder that tends to be twisted around itself. Okay, it exists in what we call a double helix. So if you took a ladder and if you twisted the ends in opposite directions, you would have a spiral helical shape. Now the rails of our ladder, and just think of the ladder in your house as an example, the rails of the ladder represent the backbone of the DNA molecule of those two strands. The next step would be to extract that material or isolate the DNA from the tissue. And at that point, we would then access the DNA from those cells by breaking them open, getting the DNA out, cleaning it up, and then putting it through our amplification process to determine a final DNA profile.
The tissue was further analyzed, and it was opened up, and there appeared to be the blood of Michael Ramsey on two sides of the tissue, and the tissue was a crumpled up tissue. The interior portion of the tissue had a substance called amylase. That portion of the tissue was tested, and that yielded the DNA of Brett Bednarz. He most likely blew his nose or wiped his face in that tissue. And it would be my opinion that he wiped his nose at a point in time when he had Michael Ramsey's blood on his hands. And that's what transferred Michael Ramsey's blood onto the tissue.
Brett Bednarz and Michael Ramsey never lived in that home at the same time together.
Detectives now move to arrest and charge Brett Bednarz.
When we were ready to proceed with an arrest for Brett Bednarz, we had several key pieces of evidence that we documented. One, of course, was the most important, was the tissue that was containing the DNA of Michael Ramsey and Brett Bednarz. That shouldn't have been in the crime scene to begin with, other than the fact that Brett dropped that tissue. after the murders. The second piece of evidence were the bloody sock foot impressions that we talked with a podiatrist that said between the known and the unknown, it's basically like a fingerprint.
One thing we, as investigators and putting the case together and presenting it to a jury, always struggled with was the fact that he had overwhelming motive to kill his mother, but motive means nothing until you see what has occurred. It was astonishing. It was astonishing what he said, and of course, when someone says these things to neighbors, to associates, to the bank teller, you don't necessarily take those things seriously. But when you see the rage that was opened up on these three individuals, you can only imagine the anger that he was feeling.
However, when the case went to trial, the jury reached an inconclusive verdict.
Although we had great DNA evidence, it still wasn't enough.
I do know that the forensic evidence in the first trial consisted mainly of that tissue. The jury was comprised of 12 individuals. I don't know what the final tally was, but they were not unanimous.
The defense attorneys argued that, listen, he lived here for years, so it's perfectly reasonable that a guy who lived here could have DNA on a piece of tissue. They argued that the house was kind of messy. The prosecutor countered with photographs of the house looking pretty tidy and saying, does this look like a messy house? Does this look like a house where someone's not going to pick up a tissue for 6 months? What ultimately hung up those two jurors, we don't know. But the state was not able to convince them that Brett was the killer.
The state now had to prepare a new trial and to present whatever new evidence they could.
The second trial, we had new evidence, as well as the testimony of Candice when she was put on the stand, specifically the receipts that we found in the safety deposit box where she had annotated that this was the day that Mom died.
This always goes back to an investigator's take on a situation. The reason this explanation is curious is because we were never able to pinpoint a time of death or a time of attack for these three individuals. They were last seen or at least established to be moving at a point in time when Beverly Therrien made a phone call at the 3 o'clock hour on a certain day. Their bodies weren't found for 3 days. Now, when a suspect declares, I was here at this point in time, our impression as investigators are, you're telling us something that only you really know or is important. Very compelling. That was introduced during the trial, and Candice Bednarz additionally testified, and she just seemed like a person who was very sympathetic to Brett, her brother. It was quite clear that he was the suspect involved in this killing. And it was so clear based on all of the motive evidence that existed. He told everybody that he came in contact with that he hated his mother, that he held her responsible for killing his father, and that he wanted her dead. What we wanted to do and what we needed to do was then establish that he was there and he was the person who committed these killings. And that came down to assessing the evidence, assessing all of the items that were found in the house when it was processed after the bodies were discovered, and see if we can come up with some forensic evidence that tied or linked Brett Bednarz to the location at the point in time when the killings occurred.
The new DNA evidence that we discovered was extremely important because Brett lived there and his DNA is going to be everywhere. How can we get specific items that will prove to us that Brett was within the crime scene and committed the murders?
Brett's mother's checkbook now became central to the case against him.
The checkbook was important because the checks that he had touched was dated around November 2010, right when the murders happened.
DNA can't be dated, but the checks and the check register could. And they were from a period of time after Brett had been thrown out of the house. So for his DNA to have been on these items, he would have had to have been in the house when he wasn't supposed to be in the house.
The state attorney also wanted to re-examine the tissue which had been so important in the first trial.
He developed a different theory about how the blood got onto the tissue. He believed it was blood that was directly deposited on the tissue.
We learned that the location of the blood was inside of the tissue. And then also the DNA of Brett Bednar's and also the mucus of Brett Bednar's was identified through his known DNA. There were special photographs that were taken by the lab as they opened up this tissue. They photographed every step that they did, and it was documented to show that the DNA was located within the tissue. It wasn't made by spatter on top of the tissue. It was deposited as if someone was wiping it off inside the tissue.
But the most compelling evidence came from the white plastic bag found at the scene.
Once we received the results of the plastic bag showing that all three victims' DNA was on that plastic bag, to include the suspect, Brett Bednar's, it was the only piece of evidence that we had that showed everybody's involved DNA was on the bag.
The compelling nature of that evidence is astronomical, because Brett Bednar's was barred from being in that home prior to the two individuals ever having stepped foot in that house. So arguably, Brett Bednar should never have had any contact or innocent DNA deposit on any item that they touched. With all three victims and Brett Bednar's on this plastic bag that was found essentially hidden behind a bookcase, it really tied a bow on the whole package. And I think it allowed the jurors to easily conclude that he was the killer.
But the detectives were still unsure whether they'd done enough to get the prosecution over the line. The tension was palpable.
The jury went out to begin its deliberations, and the family of the victims were there in the courthouse waiting for a verdict, as well as Brett's sister Candice and her daughter. Everyone was sort of clustered around the third floor of the Hartford courthouse where the serious criminal cases are tried, waiting for a verdict. Curiously, Candice stepped out for a brief moment, and that's when the jury came in. The jury foreman announced in a clear, loud voice, guilty on all counts. The sentencing came a couple weeks after the verdict, and the judge gave Brett 180 years, 60 years for each murder.
This is literally the first time I have prosecuted someone who has put such an extreme effort that was fully motivated by hatred and rage and disgust into a killing.
So what motivated Brett Bednar's?
He's a disconnected sociopath who is motivated by his feelings. How he allowed himself to go down that path and be singly driven to hate his mother and actually act out on his hatred, I have no explanation for, but that's all I see in his makeup.
They had gotten ready for bed, or maybe even were in bed, when Brett went into the house and started swinging that drywall hammer and just landing crushing blow after crushing blow.
It's the most interesting case I've ever worked. The incredible amount of work that people put through, that not just within the police department, but the community. We were getting tips from all over the country, not just in East Hartford, just everyone in the community just coming together to bring someone to justice and make sure the person that did this doesn't do it to anyone else.
The families of the victims were grateful. They believed that justice had finally been done. They had been convinced of Brett's guilt from the first trial. They had observed that and believed that the state had put on a strong case proving Brett was responsible. That, coupled with just all of the information about Brett's anger towards his mother, the rage, the horrible comments he made, the horrible names he called her, and the way they went after her money in the aftermath of the homicide, it just compounded in their minds the evidence that Brett was guilty of these murders.